Thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. This really is different. I feel like I'm like 10 feet up looking down on the masses, and it's maybe I'll get dizzy up here. But yes, as he said, my name is John Paul. I'm here with my family. That's my beautiful wife, Rachel, and my two sons, the tall one, the giant, that's Philip, and the little one, that's Thomas. We've been in ministry since a number of years. Rachel and I met in 2004 at Ohio Valley University. How many people know about Ohio Valley University? Well, some of you do. Great. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about my school. When we went to Ohio Valley University in 2004, the Bible director at that time was a man named Dr. Bruce Terry. A wonderful guy. I mean, I still consider him to be one of the most important people in my life outside of my family. And every year, he would come up probably around the first week of chapel, and he would give a message on the three tasks that every college student had to do at Ohio Valley University. The first one was to build our relationship with God. And to me, that seemed like a pretty cool thing. You're going to a Christian school. God should be number one in your life, and you should follow God with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your soul, and all the things we learn about in the Old Testament that we extend onto Jesus as we move into the New Testament. And then he would go on and he would say, the second most important thing you have to do is take care of your family. Now, the first one, I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense because, God is number one in our life. The second one I was a little bit confused about because we're here at college, and the thing that he's telling us is to take care of our family. And he told us in the way is, well, first you have to find a family. That means you are here at school to find a spouse. Me being a freshman, I'm like, I'm not really coming to school to find a wife. So maybe I'm just going to ignore that. And about 2 years later, 2.5 years later, my wife and I got married in that same place. So you can see how right he was there. The third thing he said that is we were there to get an education. It's obvious why people should go to school is you want to go to an education. But after the third year that I heard him give this speech, I went up to him and I asked him, why are you doing things in this order? And he said, well, the first one, that makes sense. But the second one, that's going to be your priority in life. God comes first, your family comes second. Everything else after that should be in a third. You are only at college as long as it takes to get your degree. And so, yes, it should be important, but it should not be the thing that consumes your life. As you move on, you're going to find the same thing applies to your job and your role and wherever you go in the world. You need to make sure that that thing comes third next to your family and your relationship with God. And so when I started preparing my lesson, not today, but last week when I started preparing my lesson, and he gave me the topic of Manasseh, I started thinking about that because if any of you have ever read the story of Manasseh, it is certainly an interesting one. Now, as I've grown up, I've noticed that there have been many important people in my life. And two of those people I want to outline to you right here, and they're both a part of my family. This guy you can see him right here, bald guy. That's my dad. Well, technically, this is my stepfather, but to me, he will always be my dad. See, when I was growing up, I was told I was so much like my father. Well, I never considered my father to be a great person, but my dad was a great person. And some of the great values I learned from my dad came from him. But then on the other side of this man sitting in the middle, this is my wife's dad. Unlike my dad, my wife's dad is a preacher, much like I am today. And anytime I find I need help in what it means to be a minister for God, I end up going to him. And for everything else, I end up going to him. I have built a strong foundation of roots in my relationship with him. Now, why do we do that? Well, we do that to make sure we grow up to be good and wonderful people that we may in turn, when we have kids of our own, hope that they may one day be good and wonderful people as well. But when you get to about chapter 33 of 2nd Chronicles. If you guys want to go ahead and turn to there, because that's where we'll spend most of our time in the text. So there is parallel text in 2nd Kings. Most of all we'll be talking about comes from chapter 33 of 2nd Chronicles. We will see that this is the introduction of a king named Manasseh. Manasseh being the 17th monarch in the line of succession since Saul was first made king. Since the line of succession divided after David, he is technically 14th after the split, but he is the son of a woman named, I'm going to butcher this, I know I am, Hephzibah? Hephzibah? Anybody got a better way to pronounce that? I'm going with Hephzibah. I like it. And also the son of Hezekiah. How many of you are familiar with either one of those names? Did you guys have a lesson on Hezekiah? I felt a little bit jealous because Hezekiah would have been a lot easier than Manasseh. Anyway, since you already know about Hezekiah, what could you tell me about Hezekiah? I like to ask questions in my lessons. Tell me something you learned about Hezekiah. He was a good king. That's probably the only thing that you really need to know about him. But there's something else about Hezekiah that you probably learned that pretty much fills out that statement a little bit more. Oh, yeah. That he was essentially, there was no other king like him. Do you guys remember reading that? There's no other king like him. So you would think that this great and wonderful king, certainly he might share some of that lineage with his son, right? Well, it doesn't really translate that well in the text. In fact, we're going to see that it ends up being quite the opposite. Now, I don't know in these lessons, how long, you guys are probably having these lessons for about a month and a half. I don't know how long this series has been going on. But it's a little bit of background of what's happening in the world at this time. There are three major superpowers that are basically at play here. And Israel is right in the middle of all three. To the southwest, you have Egypt, which has been the dominant superpower for pretty much the last 1,000 years. We've heard about it, we've talked about it, we saw them in Exodus, and then basically the world went through this thing called the Bronze Age collapse, and pretty since then, Egypt was on the decline. To the north, you have the nation of Assyria, which essentially rose out of the Hittite nation. But Assyria is now considered to be the dominant power. They've been ruling. They essentially took the northern kingdom of Israel up until this point into exile in 722 BC. And then eventually Hezekiah himself would have to pay tribute. And then, of course, you have to the east the nation that is currently on the rise, and that is the Babylonian the Babylonian nation. And we will not see them more, we'll see them a lot more prominently about 50 to 75 years from this point. Basically, a lot of this is what it's saying is you have this really small country caught in the middle of three dominant powers, and each one of them are basically vying for that land in the middle. So your king or anybody in charge of this land would have a really difficult time of dealing with these surrounding powerful nations that, one, want their land, two, if they can't get their land, they want their money, or three, want them to absorb into them culturally. That means to follow and worship their gods, to take on political alliances, or basically marry into their royal succession. This was very, very common in the ancient world, and we're certainly seeing some of that here. This isn't even really the first time we see that. We know at least one king met a lot of political alliances, and he took on many wives and many concubines, and that was Solomon. All right, good. So I know you guys are following pretty well. You can see some of these things outlined right here. I have four major worldly events that are shown with King Sennacherib, who eventually is the king in Assyria at the time of Hezekiah. Eventually, you'll see some more other kings, and these are not just marked in the biblical text, but they're also marked in some of the worldly texts as well. So all of this, I think, is what's going on in the world. And I truly believe that you have this great and you have this wonderful king, and the thing that we learn about him is that he loves God and he is doing his best for his nation. Now, anybody that loves God and is trying to do his best, I think is giving all that he has. And we could take a look, and I know you guys know, so this will be review of what Hezekiah did. And it gives a very extensive list over about, I think, 3 chapters. We see that he tore down those high places. And I always thought like a high place was a really high, you guys talk about the high places? I always thought like a high place was a really high place. And then I went to Israel and I went to Ahad, and I got to see a high place. You know what a high place was? It was about as high as this stage right here. And they would just come up a few steps, and there would be these little statues. That's all he had to tear down. It wasn't this big thing. It was just this little shrine set up. That's what he said. Get rid of those. You don't need them. Why didn't they need them anymore? Well, because they had what? What did Solomon build? They had the temple, so they didn't need the high places anymore. They could get rid of them. He destroyed the bronze snake, the one that for some reason people started worshiping. And maybe because they believed it had magical powers. We certainly saw when Moses held it up on a pole that it did what it was supposed to do. But we see that he is doing and constantly working towards having a good relationship with God and leading his people's relationship with God. But that doesn't always translate. My biggest worry with my family, the thing that my teacher was telling me, well, that was a long time ago, about 20 years ago, at least 20 years ago, 21 years ago, 20 years ago, it's been a while, was that you need to do the best job that you can to make sure your children have the best opportunity that they have. And I have to believe that Hezekiah, being the person he was, did that. But you go from what is arguably considered the greatest king in the book of Chronicles to the worst. Because this is what we read about very, very quickly when it comes to Manasseh. It says here in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, we're going to read 3 separate verses because they're all pretty much the exact same thing. Verse 2, verse 6, and verse 9. If you guys like to write in your Bibles, these are the verses I would highlight, 2, 6, and 9. First one being, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Not just that, according to the abominations of the nations who the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And then it goes on and says in verse 6, he did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him into anger. And it goes on in verse 9, Manasseh led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. Now, it's going to talk about this list, and we can see this list right about here. This is the apple falling far from the tree. There's a verse. You guys remember that church that Paul wrote to, the one that had lots of problems? We got 2 books in the Bible written to that church, the church of Corinth. Now, how many people know that the church of Corinth had lots of problems? One of the problems, when you start to get into chapter 5, Paul's going to talk about there is a man engaging in relations with his father's wife. And he will go on to say that this sin is so bad that not even the pagans engage in this practice, which that seems pretty bad. If people who have no moral standard won't do it, then that probably says something about you. And I have to imagine that him going on and he's saying that you are engaging in the abominations of the nations, that you are essentially engaging in the worst things that they could possibly do. And I'm sure some of you right now are probably already thinking about, okay, what would I consider to be a really bad thing? And I'm like, all right, maybe killing somebody, maybe a sexual assault, maybe something worse than that, maybe, I don't know, genocide across a people. Now, most of these are going to focus on the relationship with God. So we're going to see he's going to do the exact opposite of what his father did. His father, who who tore down those high places, he's now going to build them. The father who probably tore down the worship centers to Baal meaning master in the Semitic text, is now going to build new temples to him. The man who tore down the Asheroth poles, he's now going to reconstruct him. In fact, he's not only going to do all this for these false gods, but he's going to go into the holy temple, the most sacred place in all, well, almost the most sacred place. I don't know if he went to the Holy of Holies. I'm getting a little too fast. I need to slow down. Or you're not giving me my cues, honey. He's going to go into the most sacred place in all of Israel, and he's going to build shrines to these gods in the house of the Lord. And that is normally the standard to use what is a good king or a bad king, not by so much of what they do. Because if they did good things for the people, then they would be considered to be a good king. If there's one king that we could look at in the Bible who is judged as bad but probably did good things, is King Omri. King Omri did more to build the northern kingdom than any other king. But when you look at if you look at Kings and you see what it says about him, he gets about 2 paragraphs and a line that said he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. But here we're seeing that he not just engaged into these gross abomination religious malpractices, but he goes on and he does incredibly terrible things. And this one right here, this first one on the list right here at the top, he burned his sons as offerings. Now, my kids, they make me mad. You guys, how many of you have kids? How many of you just want to knock them out sometimes? You ever get that most? I love my kids to death, but there are some days, especially my teenager right here who's kind of giving me this moody look. I like to pick on you, Philip, you know. There's just some days I'm like, all right, you need to go away from me if you don't want me to kick your behind. But no, I could never imagine doing something like this. How could any parent get to the point where they would say, this is an acceptable practice? And this is how horrible he is. You can look at all the other lists, and the rest of the list is pretty bad. But this right here, for me, is at the top. And I have to wonder, how did he get here? If he had such great upbringing, if he learned what it was to be a part of a king, a nation, if he learned what it was to mean a ruler, if his dad was considered to be the great king, how did he get here? And I came up with 6 possibilities. And there are probably more. And you can tell me if you can think of any more, but these are the 6 that I came up with. And granted, this requires some speculation. I know some people don't really care for speculation, but I think it helps in this particular case. The first is he's just really young. How old is he? The text says he is, anybody reading? 12. 12 is pretty young. Thomas, stand up for a second. This is Thomas. Say hi, Thomas. Thomas, how old are you? Thomas is 12 years old. Thomas, are you ready to be king? No. Thomas, if you were king, what would you do? I would banish Philip to the dungeon. Okay, he would banish Philip to the dungeon. All right, see, this already we could tell that Thomas would not be a good king. So a part of it is, I think he's just too young, or maybe it's this idea of teenage rebellion. There's some parts of the world where this really isn't a thing, but for the most part, you can go to different places at different time periods, and you can see around the time that kids start to hit 10, 11, and 12, they start to rebel against their parents, especially because this is the time in their life where their body starting to form their own identity. And so for a lot of them, they're going through what this thing is called, they're going through what is called a paradigm shift. How many know this phrase, paradigm shift? It means they're taking a dramatic change in what they are. Everything is about to be different from them. And so maybe it's some of this. I don't really, look, see, he's already got the nose ring to go with it. That's a little bit later, though. So maybe it has to do a little bit with that. Maybe the sum of it is maybe Hezekiah wasn't as good as he thought. We know that one of the things that Hezekiah had to do to keep his political alliances, he had to pay tribute, which means he had to have somewhat a relationship with the other nations, especially with Assyria, who was growing in power. Both the biblical text and the ancient text that we see coming out of this, you can see this little stone thing right here. This is called Taylor's Prism. It was discovered, I think, in Nineveh not too long ago, maybe like 50 years ago. In the grand scheme of things, that's not too long. And it basically mentions Hezekiah by name. And so it says, much like the biblical text, as for Hezekiah the Judahite who did not submit to my yoke, I surrounded 46 of his strong cities. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence like a birdcage. I imposed upon him the tribute due to me as overlord. Meaning that I basically captured his area until he had no other choice but to give me the money. Now, we know what eventually happens to this man is that didn't work out for him because that siege eventually lasted years and they had no water. Very interesting. If you ever get the chance to go, you should go to Israel and walk Hezekiah's tunnel. It's pretty cool. So we know that maybe it was some of that he saw that his father had to compromise in some way, or at least he heard his father had to compromise in some way, and so he's probably, so he might be trying to follow that particular example. Now we know because he was young, he probably lacked wisdom, which means that he either suffered from what a lot of young rulers often suffered from, is that means either A, they had bad political advisors. There was another king that had bad political advisors. Do you guys remember that? Did you guys talk a little bit about that? Yeah, who am I talking about? Solomon? Solomon had bad political advisors. Sorry, not Solomon. Rehoboam, that's what I meant to say. That when we talk about the story of Rehoboam, his father has just died. He has now become the king. And his father's advisors say that you should lighten the load. And he goes, okay, well, let me get another opinion. And so he goes to his friends, and his friends say, you should tell them that you're in charge and you're going to make everything harder. And so in his infinite wisdom and all the wisdom that he learned from the wisest king of Israel has ever had, he's like, I'm going to make everything harder. Not a very smart plan. So maybe some of that is going on. I definitely think that if you have such a young king, he's probably getting some bad advice from somewhere. The third of it is that, of course, the political pressure I talked about. We can see here in the annals that he had to pay tribute to them, so there was probably some of that. And a fifth thing that we see is that he just probably didn't have a good heart. Do you know how much the Bible talks about how we should have a good heart? I am constantly examining every single thing I do, especially in my relationship with my wife and with God, because I want to make sure that my heart is always exactly where I want it to be. But I can read what the writer of 2 Chronicles is saying here in verse 2, where it says, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to the abominations. And that right there, that line right there, according to the abominations, you don't even have to go with the rest of the part, already tells me that he did not have a good heart. Something had poisoned it from a very young age and led well into his adulthood that he could commit such atrocities. The last thing I want to talk about here is the King's Highway. Have you guys talked about the King's Highway? No. Okay, good. I get to teach you something new. That makes me excited. The King's Highway is found in Deuteronomy chapter 17. You guys should mark it, especially if you're doing this summer. It starts in about verse 24. It basically says, it is God speaking to Moses, and God says to Moses, when you decide you're going to have a king, this is what you're going to do. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and when you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you need to make sure that that man is going to do the right thing. And says, I'm going to give you only 5 things that that man has to do. Of course, he's going to have to do all the other kingly duties. But as far as God is concerned, he only wants this man to do 5 things. Number 1, don't multiply your horses. All right? Well, why? What do horses represent in ancient Israel? Horses in ancient Israel at this time represent 2 things. The second of those is wealth. We're going to see that later on down the line. But the first of those 2 things is horses represent military. Because the stronger your horses are, the more able you are to use them for your military, so you can get those chariots and you can attack other nations. Now, it doesn't really seem to be at play here. The second of those is don't return to Egypt. Because God brought him out of Egypt, and God wants them to be dependent on him, not on the other nations. And so while Egypt is the country mentioned here, we can see that maybe a little bit of that is coming into play. Don't multiply your wives. Meaning that one wife should be good enough for you, but also that multiplying your wives means you are making political alliances, and you are again relying on the other nations. Don't acquire excessive gold. Is this starting to sound like somebody? This probably sounds like one person in particular, right? I think this is maybe a little bit of a call out to Solomon, because Solomon sets the standard and they all kind of fall apart after him. But the last one is really where I think it is at. It's like, this is what I specifically want you to do, is I want you to go to the priest, and I want you to get a copy of the law. And when you get the copy of the law, you are going to take with your own hand and you will write out a copy of the law for yourself. That means you will write out all 5 books of the Torah by hand. Has anybody ever thought they might want to write their own copy of the Bible? I thought maybe one time I might want to translate the Bible from, or at least the New Testament, from Greek to English. And after I did one small book in Philippians, I decided I never wanted to do that again. I can't imagine just writing out the whole thing by hand, especially because I have terrible penmanship. But what's the idea of this? What is he saying here? He's saying that when you write it out, you will know it. Because you had to physically read those words, translate them into your brain, and then regurgitate them back onto paper. So you are without excuse. Do you think Manasseh did this? I can't see someone doing the things he did ever doing something like this. And so I imagine that a lot of kings, they're like, well, I'm the king. I get to do whatever I want. I'm going to throw my brother in jail. Then I'm going to have cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and ice cream for dessert. And my mom's not going to stop me. Right, Thomas? Okay, got it. So, did he do any of these things? Well, the text isn't really exactly clear. But we can summarize that some of these things probably contributed to who he was. Now, our relationship with God, normally on Sunday, last Sunday, I talked about this slide right here and a lesson I was doing about Jesus in the temple. And I talked about our relationship with God, because it is in my experience that people normally have one or the other relationship with God. The first of those is what is called transactional. My wife's an accountant. She knows all about transactions. It means you give something and you normally get something, right? Or you kind of treat God like a bank or an ATM, where you're like, okay, well, I'm ready. Or some people might call it the genie with the 3 wishes. You say, okay, God, well, I need this. I'm a little short on rent this week. Please help me find a way to make rent. And then maybe God helps you, maybe he doesn't. We don't know how God works, but we do know that he always works in his will. And if it works out for you, you are ecstatic. If it doesn't work out with you, you're probably not very happy with him. And then no matter which one of those things happen, that these type of people will not talk to God again until they are ready to get the next thing that they need. Do you think that's a really strong relationship with God? Ideally, we all want to be more like this transformative relationship with God. This is what Paul talks about when he says, therefore, if anybody is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has come, the old is gone, the new has come. You have completely dedicated your life to him. You have turned over yourself. You are going to follow him in his will, no matter the circumstances. When things are great, it's awesome. When things are poor, you're trugging along and he's carrying you. But I realized when I was talking about this on Sunday, because I was already thinking about what I was going to say to you guys, is that there is a third one I completely missed. And that's this one right here, is that you have no relationship with him at all. And this is exactly what's going on with Manasseh. Is he might have learned about God from his dad. He might have seen it in the temple worship that was going on in Jerusalem, but he had no relationship with him. And because he had no relationship with him, God gave him up over to his practices. The same thing that Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23, where he says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of immortal gods for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creepy things. But our goal in life is not to live, seek pleasure, and die. There's a phrase that's been going around for a number of years now, and I'm sure some of you have heard it. It's called YOLO. You only live once. I hate YOLO. Because one, it truly denies the existence of God. But we know we don't only live once. Because we know there is another life after this, and God is constantly calling us to that other life, or as Paul says here, to bring about obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. That's what God is constantly trying to do. And those people who ignore it are saying, this is what life is all about. And so God gives it to them. But what's great about the Manasseh story, what you really don't see with all the other bad kings, is he gets a chance at redemption. And even better, he takes it. We see in verse 12 where he says, and when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed, he repented with a repentant heart. And that's one of the best things anybody can do with their life. Anybody at all. So even the worst king, the worst person in all of Israel's history to lead them can still find redemption. I know maybe that bothers some people in the world. I don't necessarily know if it bothers somebody in this room, and I'm not going to ask. But I have to believe that if God can forgive that, he can certainly forgive me. If God could forgive these terrible people, these other leaders that engaged in awful abominations, he can certainly forgive me. But people struggle with that. This past week I was looking on Twitter, and there was this big discussion on Twitter about whether or not it was better to marry a prostitute that had repented or a virgin who was prideful. And to me, the answer is very, very simple. I mean, you should marry the child of God. Well, everybody's a child of God, but you should remarry the repentant one, because you don't know where that other relationship is going to go. We are all sinners. And God says, if you believe, if you follow me, then I can wash away your sin no matter how awful you were. No one is beyond grace. And so what we see here in verse 19, in his prayer and how God was moved by his entreaty and all of his sins and his faithlessness and the sites of which he built high places and set up for the Asherim and the images before he humbled himself before. They are not written in the chronicles of seers. God forgave him. He restored him to his throne, removed him. So let's look at the lessons. There are a few lessons I want to go out here. I want to close out with. I've only got about 10 minutes, so hopefully I'll get through all of them. The first of those is, God will give you exactly what you want in the matter of sin. And I find that, there are probably some exceptions to that, like if it interferes with God's will or God's plan, then that's probably not going to happen. But if you want to engage in lust, if you want to engage in the abominations of the world, God's probably not going to stop you. But that doesn't mean that you are not going to suffer the consequences of what comes next. So if you want to do those things, hopefully there'll be people in your life to help stop you. But if you want to say, I'm not going to follow you, God, then he's probably going to let you do that. We certainly see that happening, as Paul says here in Romans. The second of those is, despite whatever you do, you're never going to beat God. Doesn't matter how great you are or how powerful you come, nothing, or how much you rebel, nothing is going to stop God from doing what God needs to do, wants to do, and will instill in this world. It's very prideful to even think that the number of people who say, I am great and God is nothing, until one day God will humble them, whether it be on this earth or the next one. For the wrath of God is revealed from the heavens against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man who by their unrighteousness suppress truth. Third, and I stress this as one who loves my kids, as one who has probably never ever been the best parent never lived up to no, that's not even right. Has failed to live up to my potential sometimes, is that we need to make sure our children are raised right. The most important verse in the Torah comes in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. This is called the Shema. The word Shema means listen. It says, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your mind, your soul. You should write it on your heart, and you shall teach it diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the wayside, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And I hope Hezekiah did that. But just because he didn't, or just because he did, doesn't necessarily mean he's going to turn out right. But you need to make sure, as a parent, you are doing your job. Next, the world easily influences us. There's so many pressures nowadays. I think they're even worse now than they were when I was a kid. Maybe even worse than when you were a kid. You have media saturation, emotional appeal, normalization of sin. All of these things are pulling you away. It says, the Lord spoke to Manasseh. How do you think he spoke to him? Well, God spoke to people, a lot of people, different ways. He spoke to Elijah in a whisper. I don't know how the Lord spoke to Manasseh, but if God speaks, I'd like to think that I would listen. I can't imagine this verse being said about me. The Lord spoke to Manasseh, and he and his people, but they paid no attention. probably because as they found everything else around them to be better. Not because it was, because they made it so. Beware of cultural compromises. One of my elders at not the church I'm at now, but the one before, had this really neat analogy. He's like, we're always making compromises with people. And in relationships, you kind of have to make compromises. But he said, when it comes to God, we shouldn't. He's like, people tend to believe they're making compromise because they're putting themselves on the right side of the cultural issue. He goes, but the problem with that is culture is always shifting. So if God's over here and culture is always shifting, and I'm just making sure I'm on the right side of culture, I'm still getting farther and farther away from God. Be careful. Do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God. Because our influence matters. Company, Paul writes this in not so many words, says, bad company ruins good morals. This is kind of a hard balance because we also need to be an influence on the world, but we need to realize that they too will be an influence on us. And if we're letting them influence us without us influencing them, then that's a net win for them, especially the net win for the world. So we need to be careful on how we're doing, the people we hang out with. Wisdom is the beginning of understanding. God uses discipline to bring us back. I'm running out of time, so I'm just trying to go through all the rest of these. True repentance requires action. I cannot stress this enough. True repentance requires action. You cannot just say, please forgive me. You think if Manasseh, after he was brought into exile and led by the nose chain, he thought, well, maybe if I just said it, I'll be okay. You think God would have been fooled by that? You can't fool God. So what happens after Manasseh repents? He fixes his problem. He goes and he takes away all the foreign idols. He clears out the temple of the Lord. It said he threw them outside the city. If you want to change, you have to actually change, because knowing better means you are being better. And finally, I think this is my last one. Yes. Sin has consequences. This is probably, I think, one of the hardest things for people to learn. What happens? I don't know how long your lesson's going to go on for. I know we're done for the King's lesson, but you look at what happens to Judea going forward. There's only going to be like 3 or 4 kings after Manasseh, and then they're going to get pulled into exile. The temple's going to be destroyed. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and the people are going to be spread all over. He might have repented, but that doesn't mean there weren't consequences for the actions he did. That's why it's so important for us to make sure to repent as quickly as possible. I hope you guys have enjoyed this lesson. I was hoping to have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I guess I'm out of time, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up here in a second. That's all I got.